Hi guys, and welcome to week 3 of Debates About Debates. And today we're going to look at debates about not solving a crisis, that was last week, about creating a fairer world. And it's good that I mentioned solving a crisis actually. I planned that, obviously. Because these two debates are kind of similar and yet essentially different, right? In the solving a crisis debate, there is an urgent problem and you really need to act now in order to solve that problem. Every minute we wait, a young person or old person or a good person will die. And that's obviously terrible. In debates about a fairer world, the harm isn't that clear or specifically time sensitive. And neither is this something that is temporal. It is not a crisis that has been caused by war or humanitarian drought or something, but it's something that's systemic, that has happened in society over a long period of time, like racism or sexism or some kind of discrimination that has been embedded in how society works, and why we need to now change, to make some fundamental changes in order to make society fairer. Okay, so there is an interrelationship. Sometimes because society has been unfair for such a long time, it creates a crisis, right? Like when we talked about prison systems and overcrowding of prisons last week. Part of the reason why the prisons could be overcrowded is because the way society is fundamentally unfair, and the prison system puts in far more ethnic minorities, puts in far more poor people, and that unfairness leads to inefficiency of the system, which leads to high recidivism, which leads to overcrowding of prisons, right? So there's a relationship, but it's not always kind of interrelated, right? And there are key differences too. So let's get down to it, right? The important thing here in Gov is to establish the unfairness. And this is an area of clash. Right? Because on Op, we can talk about whether or not that is really unfair, right? And this is the classic kind of difference about, whether you should intervene, right? A big difference is in terms of giving opportunity. For example, let me get specific. Let's say we were discussing poverty, right? Someone will say, some people might say that because there's so many poor people and that poverty has become systemic, and that is essentially unfair, right? Others may say that just because there are lots of poor people and rich people doesn't mean that is unfair, because people have the opportunity or the ability to move up and change themselves. So what we should evaluate is social mobility. And if social mobility exists, then it's not unfair just because some people are poor and some people are rich, because we will always have people who are poor and people who are rich, right? So that's just because there is that doesn't make it unfair. So it's not enough for you to show that gaps in society exists or that unfairness simply, that there are differences, but you need to show that people are unable to overcome those differences, that the unfairness or the differences have become ingrained, a permanent part of society, that unfairness is structural. Right? And that's why the situation or the system needs to be changed. Okay? So this will be the contrast, right? So over here on Op, they may say it's not unfair, right? Because people can change things themselves, right? And they will show that it's not structural, that the problems are individual or the problems are communal, right? The problems are somewhere else. Okay? Communal, community. Problems are not with the government or with the state system. So it's unfair to blame the government, but it also is not going to work if you do that, right? So you need to have the change come from somewhere else. And they believe here that the change can and should be organic, right? So on the Op side, in these debates about unfair or fair worlds, you believe in less government intervention and more individual empowerment, right? You want the government to step back and you want people to take charge. You think that while there are some barriers, those barriers are not insurmountable, that people can and regularly do fly across, leap across these barriers. And what we need to do is empower individuals to do that, right? So you want small governments and big people in a way. On the op side, you think that while those things are important, governments and systems and communities play an important role. If they don't intervene to break some of these systemic prejudices, systemic barriers, not only does it become really hard for some people compared to other people, and that's unfair, it may even be impossible for some people compared to other people, right? Your education doesn't make a huge impact on your social mobility anymore. In fact, who your parents are makes a much, much larger impact to your social mobility, and that becomes a problem, right? So that's the biggest part of this debate. Establishing the unfairness, is it unfair or not fair, and establishing the roots and the causes of that unfairness. Because when you can do that, then you can compare the solution, right? So if the cause of that unfairness isn't systemic, then your solution, right, doesn't make a difference, right? It's not going to help. If the causes are systemic, then it will help, right? So you want over here slightly bigger government. Gov is enough, right? It's not, and that's not always a bad thing, okay? And on here you're going to be more interventionist, to intervene. Over here you're going to sit back, right? Guide from afar, inspire. Find different ways to sound positive about things the other side thinks is negative. Okay, so that's the first part and a really important part of the debate, right? The second part is to show that this unfairness, to measure the impacts of this unfairness, right? That it has real and powerful impacts. So this is kind of like, impacting the solution, but also impacting the unfairness, okay? So it can be unfair that it's hard for some people to move up in society versus others. But what is the big harm that causes on society anyway, right? There's always going to be differences in society. So society functions. Those differences are not as bad as in some other societies, not as bad as it was before, or maybe the same. What's the big deal, right? So that's where you need to really develop and impact the unfairness. So it has practical consequences, right? Other than the harm to the individual too. Right, so let's not forget that. Focus very much on the group that is being targeted, that suffers, be it women, it's most always a minority, right? And why these individuals have suffered, why it's bad for them. In a responsible state, the state needs to take care of their people, etc. Every debate about unfairness, you will do lots of analysis about the target, the groups that suffer, right, and the stakeholders. But then extend that, right? So beyond that, the broader society also suffers. Okay, other people suffer. The society becomes more disenfranchised as a whole, less united, less productive, less peaceful, leads to more crime, etc., etc., etc. So we need to create a fairer system for everyone, and that's the kind of system that people will feel proud of and feel more than that for comfortable and happy living in, right? On the other side, you are talking about the impacts of intervention, right? So you can say that change happens slowly and it's longer. And why is that organic change better? It's more sustainable, right? It's more inclusive, etc., etc., etc. Or you find ways to defend the status quo. Okay, you defend the fairness of the perceived unfairness, and this is where you say that these things are not actually unfair. And changing them will make it unfair, right? Like, so for example, it's a debate about affirmative action, which is a debate about creating a more fair world, right? On the government side, you say the fairness are systemic. We need affirmative action to push people through, right? To create changes, and those changes will create even more changes. On op, you say like, no, that is what creates unfairness. We create opportunity, and then change will happen, and it is happening, but But intervening is in itself unfair and even more unfair. And why the status quo then is more fair. Okay? And I'm using the word fair a lot, but it is a key part of this lesson. Now, can you on op propose a different change? If you don't want to defend the status quo, if you think the status quo is really bad, yes, you can. You can have an alternative. So in that case, you are kind of conceding unfairness. You cannot say that it is not unfair anymore, right? Because you want to change, right? So you have to say that, yeah, it's unfair, but what you're doing isn't going to work. Here is an alternative to fair, right? So this will become become closer to the solving a crisis type of debate, where you're not providing a different paradigm on fairness and how to evaluate fairness, but you're providing a counter model. You concede that the problem is bad and needs to be fixed, and you compare why you have a different approach, a better approach to solve that problem, and then the debate becomes about comparing the different approaches. Okay? So that's the general overview about debates about fairness. I hope you can see the distinction here with debates about solving a crisis. Let's look at it from a slightly different view. I will go with pink. On government side, here you go. Serious problem with how society is working, and structural changes need to be done to create a fairer society, right? So the fairness needs to be connected to how society is structured. It cannot be just a temporal problem, right? It has to be a long-term problem. The problem is in terms of how we view people in society. They become ingrained in our mentality, so that needs to be changed. The problem is in how we elect our representatives, and that needs to be changed. The problem is in how we manage our schools, and that needs to be changed. So something fundamental needs to be changed, right? Fundamental needs to be changed. No need to overstress. Secondly, you can say that, look, we don't need to, it's not super crisis, but it harms many people, reduces productivity and value of entire society, right? And this is where you need to develop your moral high ground. You need to show that people are seriously being harmed, that it is grossly unfair, and we cannot ignore this anymore. Doing this will make it harder for the other side to show that unfairness is okay. It makes it harder for them to flip it and to defend it as an important or a normal part of a functioning society, right? If you don't really show that it's that harmful, then they're going to say it's okay. Then people can change. You can have social mobility and organic change, etc., right? On op, this is what I think is the most common approach. The society isn't fundamentally broken, but this is the type of society we prefer. Less government intervention, and society is fixing itself, and it will continue to fix itself. If you intervene, things are only going to get worse. Okay, so status quo is good. If you don't think it is, then provide an alternative, right? Shift the focus. So even if you provide an alternative, shift the focus to another group. But even if you are saying the thing is okay, society is okay, shift the focus to another group. Say that governments need to empower individuals, give individuals the tools, abilities to change. To that extent, maybe you can have some proposals, right? I'm going to give more funding to people who are poorer. I'm going to give more opportunity, lessons, improve the quality of education. That's fine, but I'm not going to have affirmative action, right? Because I think that's bad, because that's unfair, that's problematic. But empowering the individuals, hey, do it. That's great. Let individuals be the change that they want to see in the world, right? Arguments you can run on Gov, definitely talk about systemic, and talk about why organically it doesn't work. And this is a good way to think about how to make it systemic, right? Because you need to justify intervention. The other side will say that the trends are towards positive change. So how can I develop the harm in a way that the organic change is not enough, right? Either the organic change will not happen, or the organic change will take way too long to happen. And in the process, way too many people will be sacrificed, right? So that could be your approach, and that's how you need to argue, right? And also argue how, basically the status quo is failing. Checks and balances fail, current methods fail, sitting back, trends, all those things are failing. We need to intervene, and society is unfair, develop unfairness, and extend the harm of unfairness, so we need to intervene, right? Those are all the arguments you can do your direction on Gov. On Op, more broken, more unfair. Status quo is better, right? If you can, okay? If the status quo is a little unfair, right? You don't have to say the status quo is completely fair. That's how society needs to be. You can see there may be unfairness, but the philosophy of status quo is better. Less government intervention, more individual approach, or why this part of this is really, really important. We need to maintain this aspect of society. Let that work out. This is not fundamentally unfair. It's working. Okay, that's the approach from Gov, from Op. Talk about other ways to evaluate the effectiveness of your approach, sustainability, diversity, etc., and harms. Right. So if you're showing that society is working, then their intervention is going to turn things back. Right? Excellent. Major clashes. As I said earlier, what does it mean to be fair? What exactly is fairness? How do you define fairness? And what is more fair? Looking at the stakeholders here is important. You can't address, sometimes debates will address two different stakeholders, right? A society that's more interventionist on Gov here, who wants to have affirmative action, will say this is fairer for people who are poor, fairer for ethnic minorities. The other side will say, but this is more unfair for people who are not poor, more unfair for the majority. You have to meet on each other's ground. It will be great if Op can show that this will be more unfair for minorities, or if the Prop can show this will be also unfair for the majority, right? When you can do that, then you take the other side's ground as well. Otherwise, you're just not engaging, okay? And then, yeah, so this is the part about stakeholders that I was mentioning. Which are the most important stakeholders? You can take the other side's ground. If you can't take them, prioritize one over the other. Say that this is a debate about protecting the most important people, etc., and why that's really important. Maybe, right? And then, you know, of course, more benefits, more harms, and that's the secondary sort of impacts. Brilliant. So what we're going to do now, as usual, is look at a few examples. Now, the best way for us to do this is for you to prepare, right, on your own. So don't just watch what I'm doing. You should discuss this on your own and discuss a couple of things. Discuss how you're going to approach this debate. What is the key unfairness that you want to solve? Why is it unfair or not unfair, right? How it can be, why it requires structural change, or why organic change would be sufficient. And then what are some arguments you can run on either side? That's what you should do first, right? Individually or in groups, and then compare with how I'm doing it. Excellent. Now that you've done that, we can compare. So the first one, that this house would entitle housewives and or husbands to claim a fixed wage from their working spouses. So what is the unfairness? The unfairness is that these individuals are contributing to society, to their homes, but they're not receiving any benefits. Okay, so that's what the Gov side develops. They say this is incredibly unfair. You can talk about how this lack of recognition harms the individual, the worth of the individual. You can say how it leads to practical problems, right? It makes the individuals more dependent on their spouses. So in situations where there's domestic abuse, it's harder for individuals to escape. They get less freedom. All those things are problems. On the other side, you challenge this and you say that this worth is not determined by money. So the fairness is determined in a different sense, in a different way. The individuals are empowered to make these choices, right? Obviously, harm and abuse are bad things, and these things need to be solved differently. Just working doesn't mean that people get equal value or getting paid. In fact, it could be worse. Because you're being paid, you think that you may be justified It may lead to some notion of ownership over the individual, right? If this is happening in a context where women do not have that many rights anyway, then it's an extension of my patriarchal concepts. If I'm paying my wife and I gain more ownership over her, right? So that's why I think this would be more unfair. Okay, so that's one way to kind of look at the question of unfairness. On one side, not being recognized is unfair, and that leads to other types of unfairness, and why this is an adequate and appropriate form of recognition. On the other side, that this is not, well, you know, it is not fundamentally unfair, because, hold on now, so the recognition, people should be recognized, but not being paid is not an unfair form of non-recognition, right? And talk about why paying can lead to more harm, and why paying may in fact reinforce these negative attitudes and become more harmful, and instead why you will empower women in a different way. We need a change of paradigm, and we can't see these house husbands and house women as doing low value work. How's that? I hope that's sufficient. That's the approach on either side when we discuss this notion of unfairness, whether it's fair or unfair. In the extension of arguments, so definitely some arguments there. I hope you can see, right? So whether it's fair or not fair, right? Whether it is more worth, increases their worth or reduces their worth. And then you can talk about the extent, the social impacts. Whether this will encourage people to stay home, not encourage people to stay home, how it will impact the working partner and not working partner, right? On op, whether this payment, I think you should say the payment's a bad idea, and there's a lot of things you can say about why it's bad to force one person to pay the other, right? If they choose to pay, it's fine. If you want, you can say someone else should pay, but then you can't say that paying itself is bad, right? You can talk about maybe giving tax credits to couples who stay at home or to have children. That could be a way around it, because that's slightly different from assigning a monetary value to your job. That could work, but I don't think it's hard for you to say government should pay, not the other spouse should pay, right? Yeah. So that's pretty much the approach in this debate on unfairness and then the greater social impacts. It will be fantastic if you can show on op why women or the working spouses can be even more empowered in this sense, and equally fantastic on gov if you can show how the greater society will benefit from this whole view, and how the working spouses then get some kind of benefit through the pay. So why it's a good thing for them to do, but then also why it needs to be mandated. Again, try to find some kind of precedence, right, where we require one spouse to do things for other spouses, and know how it will work out well in the long term. Fantastic. Let's look at the second one. The judges should be elected. So again, what is the unfairness here? That they're not elected, right? That they're not representative of society. So a key thing in this debate will be the role of judges. Who are judges? So who do you think they should be, right? So on gov, you think that judges should reflect society, or should be reflective of society. You think that judges, mostly male, mostly old, in some countries, mostly one ethnic persuasion, and all of that's very, very problematic. They don't really understand what the people want, and that's bad, right? Because the law needs to reflect what people want. The people are held to the law, so the judges should understand what the people are being held to, right? How people are reacting in that sense. There's a disconnect between the judges and the people who are being judged. On the other side, you say, no, that's bad. Judges are not politicians, right? And that's a good thing. Judges should reflect the law. That's it. They are learned in the law. They need to know what is right, what is wrong based on the law. And that's why they have juries to a certain fact. That's why they have lawyers who will argue and people who will bring in opinions. And then they balance whether this opinion suits the law or doesn't suit the law. And judges need to maintain this type of neutrality and objectivity. Okay? So a big part of this debate, I think, will come down to this. It's unfair if, depending on which type of judge you think is better, right? So if we think that judges need to be this type of person, need to be more diverse, need to be more reflective of society, then it's unfair. Needs to be elected. But if judges don't need to do this, they need to be neutral, they need to be objective, then it's not unfair, they don't need to be elected. Alright, so a large part of the debate and the argumentation will be around this. Other arguments that you can run in this debate are the harms of elections. On OP, right? Well, not on Gov. On Gov, we'll talk about the benefits of elections, secondary ones, but the harms of elections. So, will judges now need to fundraise? Right? Will they be obligated to their electorate, to the people who voted or supported for them? All of these things you're trying to show leads to a loss of neutrality and why that's problematic. On the other side, you show that, what elections do means campaigning, means people are more informed, right? If we accept funding and being held to electorate for politicians, then we can accept how that's done with judges. Plus, we don't have to say judges need to get funders. We can separate that. We can say that the states should give a set amount of funding that the judges would use if you want to remove the fundraising aspect. But they'll need to lobby for votes. They'll need to make speeches and show why people need to vote for them. And we think that's a good thing because people will learn more, right, about the judges, about the law, and be more tuned and be more aware. We think that's wonderful. So these are the long-term benefits, right, or secondary benefits beyond the unfairness issue, which should be key to the debate, right? And that's pretty much this debate. You agree, right? I'm sure you got it exactly the same as I did. Not true. You got it better than I did. More arguments. Last debate we'll look at. This house regrets the use of negative images of Africa by international charity organizations, Africans, as a means to raise funds, right? So the regrets here means that this is just a debate about evaluating fact. You're not really doing anything. You're not positioning a policy, right? Which is different from the earlier two debates because you're saying we should do something, we should change this unfairness. So, but the assumption is if we regret it, then we should stop doing it, right? Why should we keep doing things that we think are bad? Unless we absolutely need to, but let's stop there first. So, but you're not going to say exactly what should be done and who should change or whatever. You're just saying whether or not it is unfair, not unfair. Okay? So what is the unfairness here? And I think powerful here or key to this debate is the definition, is these negative images. So what do you mean by the negative images? So images of people in poverty, right? Living in squalor. People use these things, charity organizations use these images of suffering, these very graphic images, visceral images of pain and suffering to pull heartstrings, basically, to persuade people to care more and to give money, right, as a means to raise funds. You argue that it's unfair because these images label people, these images strengthen stereotypes, right? And that's unfair. And that leads to all kinds of harm. Right? So it leads to discrimination and it leads to, in the long term, more harm. How does it lead to this discrimination? Well, you treat people from Africa or people, well, as much as you know, and think about the context again, right? So who are the people who are going to see these things? Who are the primary targets of these advertisements? People who don't have much information of what's going on there. That's why they need to use these images, right? And this shapes their personality, shapes your appreciation of people from Africa, right? And you think that most of these people live in this situation, are limited in this sense, are suffering. While many of them are, lots of them are not. And how does that shape the perception of Africans in your own community, given that we live in multi-racial, often global communities? How will that shape your perceptions of products from Africa? How will that shape your interactions, of your willingness to go there, to do things, right? And you can say that all of those things are negative, okay, and will lead to far more negative outcome. And that discrimination harms those individuals, harms those communities, right? And why it's bad, okay? And you say that this is really harmful in the long term, because in the long term, charity alone doesn't help, right? We need development, we need trade, we need empowerment of people there. And these charities, while well-meaning, are actually doing a disservice because they are pegging people into these holes. And that's going to be our appreciation of Africa, right? And that's why you're not going to get successful leaders there, or people that you appreciate or value their culture or value their products, because you think that that's the condition in which they live in, right? And they're going to be held to that condition. Okay, so that line of argumentation can be quite complex. It does have to, you have to develop a kind of long-term story, scenario. You have to really develop the importance of imagery, right? And how that imagery shapes perceptions. Talk about the target groups, right? So debate isn't really about people who live in Africa, who visit Africa, people who have diverse understanding, people who are well learned. It's people, the majority, who don't know much, which is why you have to use these things to gain their attention, right? You want to get this shock value, okay? And you talk about why that's bad. On the op, you have to talk about the necessity, right? The short term, the impact, the need. So on op, it's kind of like taking the solving the crisis approach, right? And that's how you're going to justify fairness. You're going to say that because the situation is a crisis, therefore it is fair to use these tools, right? So that's one, right? Because it is a crisis, therefore it is fair. And you need to show how this helps. And remember what we were talking about earlier. Of course, this is not going to eliminate poverty, but it's going to help people, right? Help some people, help a lot of people, not just help 1 or 2 children, but help many people through long-term impacts. It's not just about giving people shirts and shoes and toothbrushes. You build schools, you help people develop skills, you develop community centers through international funding, and this creates change across generations, right? So it's not just very kind of short-term, low-impact stuff. It is long-term, high-impact stuff, right? But you also say that it's fair because society is complex, right? Because we have counter-imagery, right? Because it's a starting point, and it helps us then learn more about these individuals and these people. It encourages engagement. It encourages to learn more and to grow, etc., etc. It's not just my engagement doesn't stop here. It goes in deeper and deeper and deeper, and that's really, really valuable. And so it's not you contend this idea that that stereotype will be formed and stop there, right? You say that it goes in deeper, okay? Because the first crisis thing kind of accepts that maybe some stereotypes might form, but it's fair because we still need to solve the problem. But secondly, you'll say that the society is fair in the sense because we need to use these, because these things don't cause long-term permanent damage, right? It's the same way we get people to be afraid about their health, right? We show really graphic images about destroyed lungs, to get smokers to change their minds. We show old people suffering to get you to think about your old age. So that's a common tool, using fear and threat and threatening people about things that are going to happen in the long term or far away in order to get you to wake up and take things seriously. So it's not unfair, right? But basically, we'll go back and forth. But what I want you to see here is we're talking about whether it's fair, whether it's not fair, right? We're talking about that based on the specific tool. We're talking about that based on the stakeholders. If you can show that this tool is unique and particularly harmful, it's unfair. If you can show that the stakeholders targeted will be specifically influenced by this, it's unfair. If you show on the other side that these tools are not particularly unique or harmful, then it's not so unfair, right? It's fair. If you can show that the stakeholders won't be seriously harmed or impacted, and in fact will have a variety of sources of information, then it's not unfair, right? But pretty much just like all the other debates about fairness, you talk about that specific tool and you talk about the stakeholders, okay? And you talk about what it means to be unfair. And then the other arguments are some of the other long-term stuff that I shared with you earlier. Whether or not this benefits long-term development, right? Whether it's a good solution, bad solution, how it impacts the charities, how it impacts education and awareness of people. Are there other things we can do, other things we cannot do, and so on and so forth, okay? But essentially a debate about fairness. So, I hope that helped. Yet again, think about this as a category, right? Try to impose, apply rather this template on other debates. Just take a motion and say, can I approach this like I was solving an unfairness or trying to create a more unfair, a fairer world? And if I'm trying to create a fairer world, what is the unfairness that I'm trying to solve? And why is that unfairness systemic? Why is that unfairness part of a structure, right? And why does this intervention need to step in? Why does this specific thing need to change? Why will organic change not happen? Okay, that is in the fairness. And why then, you know, what are some other benefits then of reducing, alleviating this type of unfairness? On the other side, say like, how can I say that something that looks unfair isn't actually unfair? That is how a fair society needs to operate. That while this is not nice and while we don't like it, it's getting better. It's improving, and we need to step back and let society kind of fix itself, and why that's a good thing. And if you intervene now, that's going to create harms, right? And those harms are going to be bigger than any potential benefit, and those harms are going to stretch for a long, long time, and you're going to regret it. You're going to regret it, and that's going to be terrible, okay? Go on, my friends, and create a fairer world. Good luck. Happy debating.